Westlyn froze mid-step, the business card in her hand trembling slightly as she read the bold, black letters once more. Zayden Calloway. The name alone sent a chill down her spine, though she wasn't sure if it was from dread or curiosity. She knew who he was. Everyone did. The young millionaire, the genius entrepreneur who had turned a small tech startup into a global powerhouse before he even hit 30. He was rich, powerful, and completely out of her league. And now he was offering her a job, not as a secretary, not as a consultant, not anything remotely normal. "Let me get this straight," she said, looking up at the man himself. He stood across from her in the quiet cafe, dressed in a sharp navy suit that probably cost more than her entire year's rent. His dark hair was effortlessly tousled, his striking green eyes watching her carefully, as if gauging her reaction. "You want to hire me to be your fake girlfriend?" Zayden exhaled, leaning back slightly. "Yes," Westlyn blinked. "For what?" "Some weird publicity stunt." His jaw tensed, and for the first time something flickered in his expression, something almost vulnerable. "Not quite. My family is hosting an event next weekend. A huge one, and my mother has made it her personal mission to see me married off to some socialite with an impressive last name. I need to redirect her attention." Westlyn let out a short laugh. "So let me guess. You parade me around, charm your family, and then, what, we break up dramatically in a month?" His lips twitched, but he remained serious. "Something like that." She shook her head, still trying to process. "Why me? You work at the art gallery my mother donates to. I've seen you there. You're intelligent, well-spoken, and you don't seem like the type to fawn over money." His gaze flickered over her, assessing. "You're also beautiful, which helps." Her breath hitched slightly at the compliment, but she quickly masked it with a skeptical look. "And what do I get out of this?" His expression didn't waver. $50,000. Westlyn nearly dropped the coffee cup she had been holding. 50, she coughed, trying to compose herself. "Are you serious? One weekend." "That's all." He slid a sleek contract across the table. "And of course I'll cover anything you need: dresses, jewelry, flights." Westlyn stared at the paper, her mind racing. $50,000. That kind of money could change her life. It could pay off her student loans, help her sick father, and finally give her some breathing room. But playing pretend with Zayden Calloway. She glanced up at him. He was watching her with a quiet intensity, his confidence unwavering. He knew she would say yes, and he was right. She picked up the pen with slightly shaky fingers. "All right, Mr. Calloway, you've got yourself a fake girlfriend." The next few days felt like a whirlwind. Zayden wasted no time in preparing her for the role, sending stylists, personal shoppers, and even a private etiquette coach to ensure she could fit seamlessly into his world. Westlyn stood in front of the full-length mirror of the luxury penthouse Sweet Zayden had booked for her fitting. The deep emerald gown hugged her curves perfectly, the diamond bracelet on her wrist glinting under the soft lighting. "This is ridiculous," she muttered, adjusting the strap. Zayden, who had been casually lounging on the nearby sofa, glanced up. His gaze flickered over her, and for the first time since their arrangement, his confident stance faltered. "You look perfect," he said, his voice lower than usual. A strange warmth bloomed in her chest, but she quickly pushed it aside. This wasn't real. She lifted her chin. "Let's get this over with." The Calloway estate was nothing short of breathtaking. The sprawling mansion, adorned with glittering chandeliers and marble floors, was filled with New York's elite. Westlyn clutched Zayden's arm as they entered the grand ballroom, her heart pounding. She had never been in a place like this before. "Relax," Zayden murmured, his lips close to her ear. "Just smile and act like you're madly in love with me." She forced a dazzling smile, leaning into him slightly. "Shouldn't be too hard." "You're not exactly hard on the eyes." To her surprise, a deep chuckle rumbled from him. "Careful, Westlyn." I might start believing you. Before she could respond, a woman's voice cut through the air. Zayden. A stunning woman in an elegant black dress approached, her sharp eyes scanning Westlyn with open curiosity. "Mother," Zayden greeted smoothly, "this is Westlyn, my girlfriend." His mother's perfectly arched brow lifted. "Girlfriend." Westlyn extended her hand, her smile unwavering. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Mrs. Calloway." The older woman took her hand, but her expression remained unreadable. "Interesting," she murmured. "I wasn't aware my son was capable of something as time-consuming as a relationship." Zayden's grip on her waist tightened slightly. "Westlyn's very special to me," he said, his voice steady. Westlyn's breath caught. He sounded so convincing, too convincing. Mrs. Calloway studied them both, then gave a slow, knowing smile. "Well, then. I suppose I'll have to get to know this special woman better." Westlyn swallowed hard. She had a feeling this weekend was going to be much more complicated than she had anticipated. Westlyn sat stiffly at the long dining table, surrounded by opulence so extravagant it almost felt surreal. The chandelier overhead cast a warm golden glow over the gleaming crystal glasses and intricately plated courses, but she barely noticed. She was hyper-aware of the scrutinizing gaze of Zayden's mother, Millionaire Calloway, who sat across from them, her expression unreadable. Zayden rested a casual hand on the back of Westlyn's chair, his presence grounding yet completely unreadable. He played his role effortlessly, engaging in conversation with his family while subtly keeping her included. It was remarkable how easily he molded into the perfect son, the perfect businessman, the perfect boyfriend. A man to Alina's right cleared his throat. He was older, his salt and pepper hair neatly combed back, his tailored suit as impeccable as the rest of the guests. "So, Westlyn, what is it that you do?" The question was simple enough, but something in his tone made it clear this was a test. "I work at an art gallery," she said smoothly, keeping her voice steady. "I help curate exhibitions and manage private collections." Alina's lips pressed together slightly. "How?" "Fascinating," she said, though Westlyn could tell she wasn't impressed. Zayden didn't hesitate. "Westlyn has an incredible eye for art," he interjected. "She's actually worked with some of the top collectors in New York." Westlyn shot him a glance, startled by his effortless defense. He had never heard her speak about her job in detail, yet he made it sound as though he had admired her work for years. Alina studied them both carefully before taking a sip of her wine. "And how did you two meet?" Westlyn felt Zayden's fingers briefly brush against hers under the table, a silent reassurance. "At the gallery," he answered smoothly. "I was looking for a piece for my office, and she helped me find something perfect." Westlyn caught the slight curve of his lips as he continued, as if recalling a cherished memory. "I was immediately drawn to her. She has this way of seeing beyond the surface, finding beauty where others might overlook it." The room was silent for a fraction too long. Even the distant clinking of silverware seemed to pause. Westlyn's breath caught at his words. He was lying, of course, but the way he said it, it felt real. Alina's gaze lingered on them before she finally leaned back. "Well, that is quite the story." The conversation shifted, but Westlyn couldn't shake the strange tension in the air. She had expected skepticism, but this felt like something else entirely. Later that evening, as the guests dispersed, Zayden led her toward the open terrace overlooking the sprawling estate. The cool night air was a welcome relief from the intensity of the dinner. "You handled that well," he murmured, standing beside her. Westlyn let out a breath, crossing her arms. "I wasn't expecting an interrogation," he chuckled softly. "That was nothing. If my mother were truly suspicious, she'd be much less subtle." She turned to him, searching his face. "Do you think she believes us?" His expression was unreadable, but there was something in his eyes, something calculating, as if he were considering possibilities he hadn't before. She will, Westlyn exhaled. You're very convincing. Zayden's gaze didn't waver. So are you. A flicker of something passed between them, something unspoken but undeniable. Westlyn quickly looked away, reminding herself this was all just an arrangement. But if it was, why did it suddenly feel like something more? Before she could dwell on it, a voice called from behind them. Zayden. They turned to see a tall brunette approaching, her designer gown flowing effortlessly with each step. Her striking features were framed with careful precision, and the way she looked at Zayden made something tighten in Westlyn's stomach. Celeste, Zayden greeted, his voice taking on a sharper edge. Westlyn instantly recognized the name. Celeste Langford, the woman Millionaire had been trying to push Zayden toward for years. She was old money, powerful, and exactly the kind of woman his mother would deem suitable. Celeste's gaze flickered to Westlyn with a polite, yet unmistakably assessing expression. So you're the new girlfriend? Westlyn forced a smile. That's right. Celeste tilted her head. Interesting. You must be quite special. Something about her tone made Westlyn's spine straighten. She wasn't sure if it was a compliment or a challenge. Zayden's jaw tensed. What do you want, Celeste? She ignored his sharp tone. Just wanted to say hello. Then, with a knowing look, she added, and to see what had you so. Distracted lately? Westlyn felt Zayden's hand press lightly against the small of her back, a clear message. He wasn't letting Celeste rattle her. Celeste's lips curved slightly before she turned. Enjoy the rest of the evening. As soon as she walked away, Westlyn let out a breath. Well, that was subtle. Zayden exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. She won't stop there. Westlyn glanced up at him. Are you worried she'll figure out the truth? His gaze met hers, something unreadable flickering in his expression. No, he said after a beat. But I am worried she'll try to make things difficult for you. Westlyn arched a brow. I can handle difficult. A slow, almost thoughtful expression crossed his face. I'm starting to believe that. For the first time since they had arrived, Westlyn felt something shift between them, something unspoken but undeniable. And that terrified her more than anything else. Westlyn sat at the grand piano in the Calloway estate's music room, her fingers hovering over the ivory keys. The polished surface reflected the soft glow of the chandelier above, casting a golden sheen over the delicate inlays. She hadn't touched a piano in years, not since her father's health had started to decline and life had become a series of responsibilities rather than joys. Do you play? Zayden's voice came from behind her. She glanced up, startled to find him leaning against the doorway, his tie loosened, the controlled businessman facade slightly undone. It was the first time she had seen him like this, not perfectly put together, not completely in control. I used to, she admitted, brushing her fingers lightly over the keys. Not anymore. He stepped closer, his presence filling the space beside her. Why not? Westlyn sighed, hesitating before answering. Life got in the way. Zayden studied her, his gaze unreadable. Play something, she hesitated. I don't think, please. The word was quiet, almost unexpected. Something about the way he said, it made her fingers press down, coaxing out a hesitant melody. The sound filled the room, soft and melancholic, like a memory barely held together. She played from instinct, letting the notes guide her, and for a moment, everything else faded: the expectations, the deception, the weight of pretending. When she finally stopped, silence stretched between them. Zayden exhaled slowly. You're incredible. Westlyn let out a short laugh, shaking her head. I'm out of practice. He didn't look convinced. You should never stop doing something you love. She turned to him, meeting his gaze. And what about you? Have you ever loved something enough to hold on to it? For the first time, he hesitated. A flicker of something passed through his expression, an emotion she couldn't quite place. But before he could answer, the sound of approaching footsteps shattered the moment. Millionaire entered the room, her eyes sharp as ever. There you are, Zayden. Westlyn straightened instinctively, feeling the weight of the older woman's scrutiny. Aliner's gaze flickered to the piano. I didn't realize you played, Westlyn. Zayden stepped in smoothly. She's talented. Aliner's lips pressed together in what could have been mild approval or concealed skepticism. How lovely. Then, shifting her attention, she added, Zayden, darling, there's someone I'd like you to meet. Westlyn knew what was coming before Aliner even finished her sentence. Zayden's jaw tightened. Mother, she's waiting in the sitting room. Aliner's expression was carefully composed, but the message was clear. She wasn't letting this go. Westlyn felt a strange, unfamiliar sting in her chest. This was the whole reason she was here to prevent exactly this. But Aliner wasn't backing down, and for the first time, she wasn't sure if Zayden would either. Zayden looked at Westlyn, something conflicted in his eyes. Give me a moment. Westlyn forced a smile. Of course. She watched as he followed his mother, disappearing down the hall. The moment the door closed behind them, she let out a breath she hadn't realized she had been holding. You shouldn't get comfortable. The voice came from behind her. Westlyn turned to find Celeste standing in the doorway, her arms elegantly folded, her gaze sharp. I'm not sure what you're talking about, Westlyn said evenly. Celeste took a slow step forward, her heels clicking against the marble floor. I've known Zayden for years. He doesn't do relationships, not real ones. Westlyn kept her expression neutral. And you would know this because, Celeste's smile was thin, because I've seen every woman who has tried. They last a few months, maybe a year, but they always end up realizing the same thing: Zayden Calloway doesn't let anyone in. Westlyn's fingers curled slightly against her dress. Maybe you just weren't the right person. Celeste's eyes gleamed with something amused. And you think you are? Westlyn didn't answer. Celeste tilted her head. Careful, darling. You might start believing your own act. With that, she turned and walked away, leaving Westlyn alone in the vast, empty music room, the silence suddenly deafening. Later that evening, Westlyn wandered through the garden, needing air. The scent of jasmine and freshly cut grass filled the cool night, but it did little to clear her thoughts. She didn't understand why Celeste's words bothered her. This was an arrangement, nothing more. So why did it feel like something was shifting? Escaping. Westlyn turned to find Zayden standing a few feet away, his hands in his pockets, his expression unreadable. She lifted a shoulder. Just needed some space. He studied her for a moment. Celeste spoke to you. Westlyn exhaled. Does she make a habit of warning your girlfriends? Zayden let out a low, humorless chuckle. She likes to remind people where they stand. Westlyn hesitated. And where do I stand? Zayden's gaze darkened slightly. He took a step closer, closing the distance between them until she could feel the warmth of him in the cool night. You tell me, he murmured, her breath caught. This is just a job. His lips parted slightly, as if he were about to say something, but instead he reached up, brushing a loose strand of hair from her face. The touch was barely there, but it sent something electric through her. This was supposed to be simple, he said quietly, almost as if he were speaking more to himself than to her. Westlyn swallowed. And now? Zayden didn't answer. Instead, he reached for her hand, his fingers threading through hers with an ease that felt too natural, too right. And in that moment, Westlyn knew this wasn't just a job anymore, not for either of them. The soft hum of conversation drifted through the Calloway estate as guests mingled over glasses of champagne, their laughter and polite chatter blending with the classical music from the string quartet. Westlyn stood near the grand staircase, her fingers lightly grazing the delicate lace of her gown, trying to steady herself against the whirlwind of emotions spinning inside her. Zayden had been at her side all evening, his touch lingering just a second too long, his gaze holding something deeper than the polished charm he showed his family. Every moment between them felt heavier now, charged with an undeniable energy neither of them had acknowledged aloud. But Millionaire Calloway was watching, and so was Celeste. Across the room, Zayden stood in conversation with a group of investors, his expression composed but his gaze flickering toward Westlyn every so often. Each time their eyes met, a silent current passed between them, a secret that neither of them had the courage to put into words. Westlyn inhaled slowly, reminding herself why she was here. This was temporary, a carefully curated illusion, but why did it feel like something more? A presence approached her, and she turned to find Millionaire standing beside her, her posture regal, her expression unreadable. "You certainly have captured my son's attention," Millionaire said, her voice smooth but laced with quiet scrutiny. Westlyn forced a polite smile. "Zayden and I have a connection." Millionaire studied her for a long moment, then glanced toward her son. "He's always been difficult to reach," she mused. "Distant, focused." "I've seen many women try to break through that." Westlyn's chest tightened, and Millionaire's lips pressed together faintly. "None of them succeeded." The words settled heavily between them, a quiet warning. Westlyn wanted to say something, to push back, but before she could, Zayden appeared at her side, his hand slipping effortlessly around her waist. "Mother," he said smoothly, his thumb brushing against Westlyn's hip in a way that sent shivers down her spine. "I hope you're not interrogating my girlfriend." Millionaire's eyes flickered between them, then softened just a fraction. "Just getting to know her." Zayden's fingers tightened slightly against Westlyn's waist, a silent reassurance. "Well, I'd like to steal her for a moment." Millionaire inclined her head in a way that was neither approval nor dismissal, then stepped away, disappearing into the crowd. As soon as she was gone, Zayden leaned in, his voice low. "Are you all right?" Westlyn exhaled, the weight of Millionaire's words still pressing against her. "Your mother doesn't believe us." Zayden watched her carefully. "Does that bother you?" She hesitated. "Shouldn't it bother you?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached for her hand, intertwining their fingers effortlessly. "Come with me." Before she could react, he was leading her through the estate, past the main hall, through a set of glass doors that opened onto a sprawling terrace. The cool night air wrapped around them, the sky a deep indigo scattered with stars. Westlyn turned to him, her heart pounding. "Zayden, what are we doing?" His gaze was intense, unwavering. "Tell me the truth," she swallowed hard. "About what?" He took a step closer, closing the distance between them. "About us," her breath caught. "There is no us." His jaw tensed. "Then why does it feel like there is?" Westlyn's pulse roared in her ears. She wanted to deny it, to remind him that this was temporary, that she had taken a job, not fallen into something real. But the way he was looking at her with something raw, something unguarded, made it impossible. "Zayden." His fingers brushed against her cheek, a touch so gentle it made her breath hitch. "I told myself this was just an arrangement," he murmured, "that it was all for show." Her chest tightened. "And now," he exhaled, his forehead nearly resting against hers. "Now I can't stop thinking about you." Westlyn's throat tightened. "This isn't real." His fingers tilted her chin up, forcing her to meet his gaze. "It is to me." A storm of emotions crashed inside her. She had spent the last few days convincing herself that this was temporary, that she could walk away unscathed. But now, standing here beneath the stars, with Zayden looking at her like she was the only thing that had ever mattered, she wasn't sure anymore. Before she could think, before she could talk herself out of it, she closed the remaining space between them. His lips met hers in a kiss that stole the air from her lungs. It wasn't careful. It wasn't hesitant. It was consuming. Zayden's hands gripped her waist, pulling her closer, as if he was afraid she'd disappear. Westlyn melted into him, every thought, every doubt, every fear dissolving into the night. When they finally broke apart, he rested his forehead against hers, his breathing unsteady. "I don't want this to end when the weekend is over." Westlyn's heart pounded. "Zayden," his hands tightened around her waist. "Tell me you don't feel the same and I'll let you go." She opened her mouth, ready to say the words that would end this before it spiraled further out of control. But she couldn't. Because it would be a lie. Instead, she whispered the only truth she had left. "I don't want it to end either." Zayden exhaled, his relief evident as he pulled her into him once more, holding her like she was something he wasn't willing to lose. And for the first time since this arrangement had begun, Westlyn realized she wasn't playing a role anymore. She was falling, and there was no going back. Westlyn stood at the edge of the Calloway Estates ballroom, the glittering chandeliers casting a golden glow over the sea of elegantly dressed guests. She had expected the night to feel like an elaborate performance, a final act in their carefully crafted illusion. Yet after the terrace, after the kiss that had shaken the ground beneath her, nothing about this felt like an act anymore. Zayden was across the room speaking with a group of executives, but his eyes flickered toward her with quiet intensity. A silent promise. She was in deep. A warm hand brushed against her elbow. "Enjoying yourself." Alina's voice was smooth, unreadable as always. Westlyn straightened, meeting the woman's gaze. "It's a beautiful event." Alina studied her for a moment, then took a slow sip of champagne. "You've certainly managed to hold Zayden's attention longer than most." Westlyn forced a steady breath. "I care about him." Alina's lips pressed together faintly, her expression composed but sharp. "Do you?" The weight of the question settled between them. Westlyn knew what Alina was implying. If this was a game, a ploy for money, or an attempt to climb the social ladder, the Calloway matriarch would see right through it. But this wasn't a game anymore. "Yes," Westlyn said, her voice unwavering. "I do." Something shifted in Alina's expression, not approval, but something closer to curiosity. Before she could say anything else, a loud chime rang through the room, signaling the start of the evening's speeches. Zayden excused himself from his conversation, stepping up to the raised platform at the head of the ballroom. The crowd quieted, all eyes turning to him. Westlyn felt her pulse quicken. "Thank you all for being here tonight," Zayden began, his voice carrying through the grand space. "This event is more than just a gathering, it's a celebration of the people who have shaped my life, my career, and my future." He glanced toward his mother, nodding slightly before his gaze found Westlyn. "And if there's one thing I've learned, it's that success means nothing if you don't have the right people beside you." Westlyn's breath caught. The room remained silent, the weight of his words settling over the crowd. Zayden exhaled, his confidence unwavering. "I wasn't always sure what I wanted. I thought I had everything figured out." "But sometimes life surprises you." His gaze locked onto hers. "And sometimes it brings you exactly what you never knew you needed." A hush fell over the room. Westlyn felt the world tilt, the realization crashing over her like a tidal wave. He wasn't just saying this for the audience. This was real. The moment stretched between them, unspoken but undeniable. Then the applause erupted, breaking the spell. Zayden stepped down, shaking hands with guests, but his eyes never left hers. Moments later, he was at her side, his presence grounding. "You meant that," Westlyn whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of conversation. Zayden didn't hesitate. "Every word," her heart pounded. "What happens when this weekend ends?" His fingers brushed against hers, the touch deliberate and sure. "That's up to you." Westlyn swallowed hard. "Zayden, this started as an arrangement," he nodded, "and now it's not." She searched his face, looking for hesitation, for doubt. There was none. "I don't want this to end," he said, his voice quieter, more certain than ever. "Not when it's the only thing that's made sense in a long time." Westlyn's chest tightened. This wasn't just a fairy tale moment, a fleeting illusion born from luxury and circumstance. This was real. And for the first time, she wasn't afraid to believe it. Zayden reached for her hand fully this time, lacing his fingers through hers. "Stay," he murmured. Westlyn exhaled, the weight of everything falling into place. She had spent her life waiting for stability, for something that felt like home, and somehow, against all odds, she had found it in him. She squeezed his hand, a small but certain answer. "Yes." Zayden's lips curved, and for the first time since this all began, Westlyn knew she wasn't just playing a role. She was exactly where she was meant to be. The night air was crisp as Westlyn stepped onto the balcony, her fingers still tingling from where Zayden had held them. Below, the estate's gardens stretched out in elegant symmetry, the marble pathways gleaming under the soft glow of lanterns. The sounds of the gala drifted through the open doors, but she couldn't focus on anything except the weight of what had just happened. Zayden had told an entire room of the richest, most powerful people in New York that she was what he never knew he needed. That wasn't something a man like him said lightly. And yet doubt gnawed at her. Footsteps approached, slow and deliberate. She knew it was him before she even turned. "You disappeared," Zayden said, his voice softer than usual. Westlyn kept her eyes on the horizon. "I needed air." He came to stand beside her, his warmth seeping into the space between them. "Are you doubting me?" She hesitated before answering. "I'm doubting myself." Zayden's gaze was steady when she finally looked at him. "Why?" "Because this wasn't supposed to happen," she admitted. "I was supposed to pretend for a weekend, take the money and go back to my life." His jaw tightened. "And now," Westlyn exhaled, pressing her palms against the cool stone railing. "Now I don't know what happens next." Zayden reached for her hand, his grip firm, grounding. "Then let me make it clear. I don't want you to go back to your life as if this was nothing." Her pulse quickened. "Zayden, you have an entire world here. A world I don't belong in." "You belong wherever I am," he said simply. Westlyn's breath caught. He was so sure, so unwavering, and she wanted to believe him, but reality wasn't a fairy tale. Before she could respond, the sound of hurried steps interrupted them. One of Zayden's assistants appeared in the doorway, his expression tense. "Sir, I'm sorry to interrupt, but there's an issue with the European Division's deal. They're demanding an immediate call." Zayden clenched his jaw, glancing between Westlyn and the assistant. Westlyn forced a small smile. "Go, your business needs you." He hesitated, his fingers tightening around hers for a beat longer before he let go. "This conversation isn't over." And then he was gone, swallowed back into the world that had always belonged to him. Westlyn exhaled slowly, wrapping her arms around herself. She had fallen for a man who had an empire to run, a life that demanded every part of him. Where did she fit in that? A voice cut through her thoughts. "You're thinking about leaving." Westlyn turned sharply to see Eleanor standing a few feet away, her gaze sharp, knowing. Eleanor lifted a hand. "Don't deny it." "I see it in your eyes." Westlyn swallowed hard. "I don't belong here." Eleanor studied her for a moment before stepping closer. "Do you believe my son is a fool?" Westlyn blinked. "What?" "My son," Eleanor repeated. "Do you believe he makes reckless decisions, that he doesn't know what he wants?" Westlyn shook her head. "No, of course not." Eleanor's lips pressed together. "Then why do you think you know better than he does?" Westlyn froze. Eleanor sighed, clasping her hands in front of her. "Zayden has spent his entire life making decisions based on logic, on strategy. If he has chosen you, it is not by accident." Westlyn's heart pounded. "And you?" "You've questioned me from the moment we met." Eleanor's expression remained unreadable. "Because I needed to be sure that, when the time came, you wouldn't run." Westlyn's breath hitched. Eleanor's gaze softened just slightly. "My son is not a man who offers his heart lightly. If you walk away now, you will break it." The words settled heavily between them. And then Alina turned and walked away, leaving Westlyn standing there, her mind spinning. She needed to make a choice. Zayden sat in his office, his hands clenched into fists on the desk. The call had been handled, the deal salvaged, but his thoughts were elsewhere. On her. Westlyn had been slipping through his fingers all night, and he had the sinking feeling that if he didn't act now, she would disappear entirely. He wasn't going to let that happen. Pushing back from his desk, he strode out of the office, down the hall, searching for her. Every part of him was on edge, his heart pounding as he reached the terrace. Empty. Panic clawed at his chest, then movement near the front entrance caught his eye. Westlyn. She was standing by the grand staircase, staring at the doors as if preparing to walk through them. Westlyn? She turned at the sound of his voice, her expression conflicted. Zayden, no. He closed the distance between them in 2 steps. You don't get to leave like this, her breath hitched. I don't want to be something temporary in your life. His jaw tightened. Who said you were? Her eyes searched his. This world? I don't care about this world, he cut in. I care about you. Westlyn's lips parted, but no words came. Zayden exhaled sharply, his hands coming to frame her face. I'm not letting you go, not now, not ever. Tears pricked the corners of her eyes. Zayden, I love you. The words were raw, unguarded. Westlyn sucked in a sharp breath. I love you, he repeated, his voice rough with emotion. And if you walk out that door, I will chase you. I will spend the rest of my life proving to you that you belong with me. A tear slipped down her cheek. And then she was throwing her arms around him, burying her face in his chest. I love you too, she whispered, the words breaking free like a dam bursting. Zayden let out a shaky breath, his arms tightening around her as if he would never let go. And he wouldn't. Not now. Not ever. The following year, Westlyn stood in front of the Calloway estate once more, but this time she wasn't a guest. She was home. The courtyard was filled with laughter, music, and the scent of roses. Guests gathered under twinkling lights as she stepped onto the grand balcony, her fingers laced with Zayden's, her husband's. She glanced up at him, a smile playing on her lips. Did you ever think it would turn out like this? Zayden tilted her chin up, pressing a soft kiss to her lips. I knew from the moment I saw you, Westlyn laughed, shaking her head. Liar, he grinned, pulling her closer. Maybe, but I knew I wasn't letting you go, she exhaled, leaning into him. The doubts, the fears, the uncertainty, it had all faded, because she belonged here, with him, forever.